So my goal for today is to turn sine of theta squared plus cosine of theta squared equals 1 into tan of theta squared plus 1 equals secant of theta squared. So looking at this, you might get confused because you're wondering, how do I turn tan to sine or sine to tan? Well, my first step was, I thought, what is one identity that I'm supposed to know? That is this fact that tan of theta is equal to sine of theta over cosine of theta. And even though this is squared, it can still work both ways because both the tan and the sine are already squared. So the next step is you have to divide it by a cosine. So we're going to divide that whole equation by cosine theta squared because it has to be squared both on the top and on the bottom. It can't, or else this identity won't be able to be used. So next step is I like to break these equations up into fractions, into smaller fractions, which is then it turns into sine of theta squared over cosine of theta squared plus cosine of theta squared over cosine of theta squared equals 1 over cosine of theta squared. So now we can apply this fact that we already know from earlier in the video to this fraction, which then turns into tan of theta squared. Then we know that anything divided by itself is always 1, and that does not change with trigonometric functions. So we can cancel that out because it's just 1 because it's itself divided by itself, so plus 1. So we already have the first part of the equation. So then you might be thinking, how will I prove that 1 over cosine theta squared is the same thing as secant theta squared? Well, that brings me to another fact that we need to know when dealing with trigonometric functions, and that is secant theta squared is equal to 1 over cosine theta squared. So since if we already know this fact, we can automatically just turn 1 over cosine theta squared into secant theta squared. And we just proved that sine of theta squared plus cosine of theta squared equals 1 is able to transition from itself to tan theta squared plus 1 equals secant theta squared.